The final governance model that I'd like to address in this series of videos is what I'd like to call the public stakeholder model, in which the public's interest in a firm is represented by making the state a shareholder of a corporation. Now, the rise of industrial total war in the early 20th century tended to catalyze the collectivization of a lot of assets under state ownership. Later on, after the First World War, others passed into the hands of government through nationalization. We see the same sort of process repeating itself during and after the Second World War. Now, state-owned enterprises may be either wholly or partially owned by their government. They may operate at arm's length or in close concert with policymakers. But what really defines them is the idea that the state owns shares in the corporation and tends to have the loudest voice at the table when there's a discussion going on about how to allocate the firm's resources. So while economic benefits of a state-owned enterprise might be shared with private investors, control almost universally resides with the state. Now, this type of government arrangement is often subject to various kinds of corruption, as unfortunately, there are very few other stakeholders who are able to hold the state itself to account. In many countries, the kinds of companies that operate as state-owned enterprises are usually those operating in what are deemed to be strategic industries like energy, mining, telecommunications, or defense. Generally, the kinds of industries where foreign control might represent a threat to national security. And we see examples of these all over the world, whether we're looking at Saudi Aramco or EDF in France, Baosteel in China, Rosoboronexport in Russia. The idea is that state-owned enterprises effectively work to safeguard national security interests in many cases by limiting the extent to which a takeover by a potentially hostile country or hostile entity could impede the well-being of an entire country's citizens. Now, these types of organizations are not only seen in Eurasia, we absolutely see them all the time in North America as well. For instance, Air Canada and CN Rail were both state-owned enterprises until the late 80s, mid-90s in the United States. Such things as the United States Postal Service and Amtrak are wholly owned state-owned enterprises. So most countries around the world do make use of this type of model to some extent. It's really a matter of how much state-owned enterprises represent out of the total economic activity of the nation. In general, as we'll discuss in our final talk in this course, governments are often the largest single economic actor, but in many cases, their influence is diluted across a number of different state-owned enterprises. Now, these state-owned enterprises are usually shielded from competition to some extent, because they are a source of government revenue. And that often means that governments are going to establish regulations and laws in such a way as to favor their own enterprises over any potential upstarts that might challenge the economics of these kinds of businesses. Now, protectionism generally is seen as being a bad thing in economics, but it can often be useful for sustaining national imperatives, which are generally not modeled in economic analysis. It's hard to put a price on things like being able to protect our national security, strictly speaking, the kind of thing where people might be by the thousands willing to give up their lives to protect. Putting a dollar price on such a thing is particularly challenging. And it leads us to think about, for instance, the cost of defense. While many people simply think of defense expenditures as a black pit in which money never returns, it's important to recognize the second and third order effects which result from this. And this is important when we start to think about the motivations behind state-owned enterprises. Nonetheless, we should still be careful about our state-owned enterprises, as ultimately they're responsible to the state, and hopefully the state is responsible to us as citizens. And this means that there are important things that we should do to improve the governance and allocation of them, even if that means trying to pressure our own governments. In many cases, state-owned enterprises are regarded as being inefficient with entrenched management. It's hard for the people who a state-owned enterprise is supposed to be serving to actually bring any kind of pressure for innovation or efficiency when the directors or managers of a state-owned enterprise are really only responsible directly to their government, meaning that the system that we see between a shareholder-owned enterprise, for instance, that's seeking profit, and its customers is one where the shareholders might immediately seek to remedy a problem that their customers are experiencing. Meanwhile, a state-owned enterprise might feel no such compulsion whatsoever, knowing that it operates in a protected and controlled industry and that none of the other stakeholders outside the government actually has the ability to dismiss them. Similarly, we often see state-owned enterprises being used as effectively sponges to soak up the unemployed masses in some cases. So a few years ago, 300,000 soldiers were demobilized from the People's Liberation Army, for instance, and rather than simply leaving 300,000 unemployed young men who knew how to use machine guns and grenades, the Chinese State Council actually ordered state-owned enterprises to create jobs for all of these people. Whether there was anything productive for them to do or not, the fact was that leaving them on unemployment rolls would have been highly destabilizing to the nation, and thus state-owned enterprises stepped in to act as a policy lever for the nation itself. Now, when we start to consider the full range of activities of state-owned enterprises, we recognize that they are not solely motivated by maintaining social stability or necessarily driving profits to help finance government programs. In some cases, state-owned enterprises are directly used as instruments of statecraft, whereby one government might influence the behavior of another government or other commercial enterprises around the world through the directions they supply to state-owned enterprises. For instance, ordering their state-owned firms to purchase goods from certain countries or to deny purchases from certain countries. And this can lead to state-owned enterprises being used effectively by governments as low-key weapons against one another, attempting to influence their behavior rather than through military force, instead through a form of economic coercion. Now, state-owned enterprises have been with us for a very long time, and given the direction that things have moved in the last 150 years regarding the state's role in the economy, we can probably expect them to be with us for some time. Nonetheless, there is something to be said for trying to find ways to improve the functioning of state-owned enterprises. If we're going to be living with these state-owned enterprises, we may at least find ways to try to align the interests of our allocators who work within them with the interests of society at large, rather than simply the interests of their paymasters in government.